Are you seeing it?
Yeah,
Yes,
that's very good, Francie. We can see it.
Okay, John, if you want to introduce Francie, and then you can go from there. Thank you.
Okay, Francie Von Merton has written about nature in the backyard and beyond for decades, including a column in the Monadnock Ledger transcript and scripts for New Hampshire Public Radio's Something Wild. She's an active land conservationist with the Harris Center, New Hampshire Audubon, and her hometown, Peterborough. She helped create the Harris Center's Pollinator Garden, learning a lot about bees and pollinators who are without equal. They are in decline along with honeybees, and she's eager to lure others into their world and their care. She was a star volleyball player in the heyday of the Peterborough Recreation Volleyball League. I know this for a fact because I was fortunate to be her teammate for almost 20 years. Francie has 2 grown children and lives in Peterborough with her husband, Carl. Please give a warm Rotary welcome to Francie Von Merton. The floor is yours. The stage is yours.
All right, thank you, John.
You're welcome.
Great volleyball memories. So here we go. This is an abridged talk of a much longer one, so it's quite information packed, and let's get going. Native bees, the pollinator pros. By native bees, that means wild bees that were here before the European honeybee arrived with European settlers. And they live very much in the shadow of honeybees, and I hope in the next 10 to 15 minutes you fall in love with them. And they are very industrious, as John said, hard workers, very good community citizens. So here's a picture of an iconic New England apple orchard. There's 7 wild bees at work, all shapes and sizes, and familiar bumblebee lower left corner, the largest one. Over 100 wild native bees have been found pollinating apple orchards in New England, and there are over 200 native bees in New Hampshire. Some are very tiny and really live in the shadow of honeybees. Let's see. This is a blue, I just found out how to move things along. This is a blue orchard bee. She is loaded with pollen. That's her main interest in terms of food. She's going to take it back to her nest and create a pollen ball. She'll lay an egg on it, and the egg will hatch into a larva. There is one right there, and the larva will feed on the pollen ball. A blue orchard bee is a specialist. It's very well named. It pollinates fruiting trees, and in fact, it's the only pollen that her larvae can feed on. It takes about 250 blue orchard bees to pollinate an entire acre of apple trees. So if we're comparing native bees with honeybees, a logical question, how many honeybees will it take? 1.5 to 2 honeybee hives. And there are up to 5,000 honeybees in one hive. So that's quite a efficient, native bees are quite efficient and hard to believe. So we'll explore how that's possible. First of all, why focus on pollinators? Most flowering plants require pollination by animals, and by animals, mostly native bees. The rest of plants, mostly trees and grasses, are wind pollinated, little tiny grains of pollen that also get into our eyes and nostrils and create allergies. When we talk about the benefit of pollinators, usually humans are the focus. 1/3 of what we eat and drink, but there's a much broader context. Pretty much whatever you see out and about in the natural world. Anything that flowers must be pollinated, nuts, seeds, fruit, berries, leafy greens, root crops for humans and the wider living community that we're a part of. I think we all know that pollinators are in serious decline. A little bit of sex quickly. Here's a blossom. Pollen is created by anthers. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 anthers here creating pollen. And the female part of the flower is a stigma, and the pollen has to be delivered to the stigma. Over on the right, you see the stigma, and the pollen goes down a pollen tube, also called sperm pollen, into the ovary where the eggs are fertilized. So male pollen must be delivered to the female stigma. Here's a really important distinction: pollinator versus plant visitor. Often listed as pollinators, so many: butterflies, hummingbirds, moths, wasps, bats, bugs, beetles, flies. And here's a tiger swallowtail on an echinacea. They're visitors mostly. They're after nectar, not pollen. And there's on this tiger swallowtail, you can see the long tongue, the proboscis. She's extracting nectar only, and she'll go on to another flower, do the same thing. She is dusted with pollen. I don't know if you can see that clearly, but will that pollen get transferred to another flower? Some, yes, but not very efficiently. There is one exception. Chocolate midges are the only pollinators of cacao trees. It's a no-see-um, tiny midge, and it's very hairy, and you can maybe see some pollen grains on it, and it will go flower to flower, but there are very few efficient insect pollinators because, or not because. The top pollinators are the bees. This is a queen bee. She's just emerged. It's a crocus. I think you can recognize it's an early bloomer. And this queen bee has just emerged from winter hibernation, very, very hungry. She's after pollen. Note how messy she is. There's pollen all over her. So as she goes from flower to flower, that pollen is going to be transported from flower to flower. Here's a crocus that lots of plants have lines on them, and they're like guidelines telling the pollinator, okay, here's where the good food is. This bee is pollinating lupin north of Conval along the roadsides. Why are they such good pollinators? They're very hairy, and the hairs are branched, all the better to catch and hold pollen. Pollen baskets carry a lot of pollen, so there's less time commuting back and forth to the nest and more time pollinating. A bee can carry up to 80% of its body weight in globs of pollen. Also hard to believe. This is hugely important: flower constancy. Bees generally focus on one plant species at a time. So it goes lupin to lupin to lupin to lupin, which makes great efficiency sense, rather than trying to figure out the mechanics of a different kind of flower. So they stay with one. And so lupin pollen gets delivered to lupin. Goldenrod pollen gets delivered to goldenrod, clover to clover. In fact, if goldenrod pollen was delivered to clover or clover to goldenrod, it could jam up the works. This is my favorite part of falling in love with bees: buzz pollination. Bumblebees and a few other native bees grab onto a flower, disengage their wings, and they vibrate with a very audible buzz. And that shakes the pollen loose onto their bodies, which they comb onto their hind legs. There's electrostatic stuff going on here. The bee's body is positively charged and the pollen is negatively charged, and that makes the pollen leap onto the bee's bodies all the more quickly. I don't understand it all, but bumblebees can pollinate flowers that have pollen that's really hard to access. Cranberries, this is cranberries in our backyard here in the photo. Blueberries, peppers included, and tomatoes. Bumblebees are the only pollinators of tomatoes. Tomatoes don't produce nectar. It's a bit of an oddity. And so other pollinators aren't attracted to them or other insects. And the logical question, why do some plants make pollination so difficult that only a few species can pollinate them? A plant, it takes great energy for a plant to produce nectar and pollen. They don't want plant visitors to come by and steal the nectar without creating pollination relationships. The only reason plants make nectar is to attract pollinators. And when a flower is pollinated, the plant stops producing nectar and pollen, and its energy goes to developing fruits and seeds. So native bees, 200 native to New Hampshire, were here before Europeans arrived with their honeybees, and they got the job done perfectly well. And here's a comparison. Honeybees, here's a honeybee. They're tidy feeders. And so when they go flower to flower, they're transporting less pollen. They have short tongues. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Forage up to 2 miles from the hive. And so they lose lots of time commuting back and forth. Also, they'll remain snug, they'll remain snug in a hive in wet, cold weather, relying on stored food. So think of April showers, bring May flowers. Lousy weather in terms of honeybees, they're going to stay in their hive and they're going to eat stored honey. And the queen bee and the crocus, she has no choice. She's really hungry, emerged from hibernation. She's got to feed herself. Here's a native bee, pretty messy, covered with pollen, electrostatically collected maybe. Messy feeders, they nest close to their favored plants, spend a lot less time commuting. There's a great diversity of native bees. You saw 7 of them on the apple blossoms, shapes, sizes, and a diversity of tongue lengths, which are needed to pollinate a diversity of flower shapes and sizes. Think of all the flowers that you know. Some tubular, some not so. So that's important. When you see 2 exclamation points, that means it's really important. They forage in wet, cold weather because they lack stored food back in their nest. Maine is a blueberry state. They do lots of studies on bees. And it's been determined that bumblebees visit twice as many blueberry flowers a minute than honeybees visit. Oregon cherry study, bumblebees are active twice as many hours a day. So this is all helping to explain why the blue orchard bee is so much more efficient than honeybees in pollinating what they specialize in. Okay, we've got a couple gray slides here, pretty somber stuff. Maybe 5 years ago, there started to be articles on the insect apocalypse. New York Times, lead article, National Geographic has done a number of articles. Insect apocalypse. Bees, butterflies, and other insects are under attack by the very plants they feed on as US agriculture continues to use chemicals known to kill. Studies increasingly support what entomologists call the windshield phenomenon. And that's something that we've probably all noticed, fewer squished bugs on car windshields over the decades. For native bees, most studies focus on bumblebees. They're big, they're easy to see, but what's going on with bumblebees is also assumed to be going on with the other multitude of bees, native bees. Most are in decline. Some are locally extinct, extirpated in most of their historic range. New Hampshire has lost a number of its bumblebees. New York Times editorial titled Insect Armageddon. One thing is already clear, the fate of our world's insects is inseparable from our own. So here's 3 photos that can help tell the story. Almond orchard in California, pretty much as far as the eye can see. It's a monoculture. There's no edge habitat that would have wildflowers or nesting habitat for food or nesting habitat for native bees or honeybees. And so honeybees have to be shipped in, which is stressful. Many stressors on honeybees, a limited diet, almonds 1 month or a couple weeks, and then on to the next crop, travel, congestion, pathogens, and some of those pathogens spread over to native bees. In China, there's a region that's known for its fruit orchards, and pesticides have pretty much killed off the pollinators, and the trees are hand pollinated. And then we have our iconic, again, New England orchard, nesting habitat, wildflowers, food for native bees throughout the season, not just apple blossoms in May. So what can we do? Feed them. Here's a milkweed with a couple bees on it, goldenrod. They're both considered weeds. They're hugely important to native pollinators. Milkweed, of course, for monarch butterflies. Don't kill them. These are, there's a series of pesticides known as neonicotinoids, which are called neonics for short. It's a systemic neurotoxin, and it can be treated either on a seed, on a plant, or in soil. And it's a very standard lawn treatment for grub control. And this big red arrow is pointing to imidacloprid, which is one neurotoxin. It's been banned in the European Union, Canada. Some towns have banned it in schoolyards and playgrounds, and a lot of homeowners have no idea what's being applied to their lawn. And so that's just one example. The good news, there is good news. The good news is that plant growers have phased out. A lot of major plant growers, Proven Winners is a very big one. They've phased out this neurotoxin. So we're learning. Feed them, don't kill them, and house them. Most native bees are ground nesters, and here's a diagram showing the queen bee creates these tunnels with brood cells, lays the yellow pollen ball, and lays an egg on it. And then there are larvae in different sizes, stages of development, feeding on the larva of the pollen ball. Others are nest in tunnels. Here's a pollinator garden that the gardener has planted a stump in and drilled some holes in. Another way to help out the native bees. The, John mentioned the Harris Center Pollinator Garden. That's when I learned about helping with that. That's when I learned about neonicotinoids, and that was back 7 years. And we did research. It would be pretty terrible to design and plant a pollinator garden and be killing the pollinators. So we're very careful about plants that have not been treated with neonicotinoids. And again, most growers have stopped that treatment. So that's good. So these are spring, summer, fall plants. Some are wild. Again, the goldenrod. Juneberry up top in spring, Amelanchier is one of our early bloomers. You can get them in nurseries, and also they're in the wild, very visible in May. Foam flowers in the Harris Center garden. Pussy willow. If you know pussy willows, go take a look at them early spring, and you'll see pollinators, a variety of pollinators on them. So that's about it for my slides. There is growing attention being paid. Pollinator gardens, pollinator landscaping. We have, Carl and I built a new house here, and I've been madly landscaping for pollinators, mostly native plants. They've co-evolved with insects, and they are most helpful to insects. There are societies, a Xerces Society, nationwide, Native Plant Trust out of Massachusetts. They do fabulous advocacy and education. And finally, it looks like I'm picking on honeybees. I'm not. Honeybees get a lot of attention, and I'm just so eager for native bees to come out of the shadows of honeybees. Also, monarchs get a lot of attention, deservedly so. And what benefits native bees is going to benefit honeybees and monarchs also. So I'm not picking on honeybees. I just want to give attention where it's due. It's time for wild bees to get a lot more attention and some help. I hope we owe them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francie.
Thanks, Francie.
Francie, I've got a question. It's a great presentation. Can honeybees and wild bees coexist without any issues around here? Or is there, is there any conflict?
That's a great question, and it's territory I hesitate to move into. Honeybees and beekeepers. Beekeepers love their honeybees. And the hard reality is that it's becoming pretty clear that they are in competition. And Susie Spickle, some of you might know at the Harris Center, wonderful teacher naturalist. And she was one of the most committed beekeepers, so in love with her bees. And maybe 2 to 3 years ago, she stopped keeping bees, and that was her choice. And I almost hesitated to tell her that there is this growing knowledge that honeybees aren't doing native bees much good, and in fact could be out competing them. She learned that on her own and made that decision, and I respect it greatly. Honeybees are very important agricultural pollinators. And there's a difference between agricultural and ecological. And it's the native bees that have a huge ecological role, which is just about all that you see out there, the growing vegetative world that humans rely on, but also the insects. So it's a tough question and it's a tough reality, but I appreciate your asking it.
Yeah, Laura?
I have a question. Thank you, Francie. That was wonderful. You can't see me. I'll get my head over here.
You mentioned that leafy greens need to be pollinated. What, how would that work?
Say that again?
You mentioned that leafy greens need to be pollinated.
Oh. Well, all plants blossom at some time. And so spinach will have a blossom. And so the pollination starts the process of regeneration. And so that's lettuce goes to seed, it'll flower. I think after the leafy greens, how does the progression go? After the leafy greens are produced, then it flowers and goes to seed. So you want to get your lettuce before it goes to seed.
Thank you.
And so it's regeneration. It's the next generation.
So should we let our lettuce plants, some of them grow to be into seed, or should we just crop them all off?
I can, as a gardener, I do that with cilantro. Cilantro comes up quickly. It actually reseeds in my garden, and it bolts, the term, and it goes to seed, and it gets really tall, and pollinators absolutely love cilantro flowers. So I'll leave it for the pollinators. But I think it's a good awareness of what we can do to help them. So much of what we can do in backyards is lawns. Lawns are not helpful to pollinators. If we can shrink our lawns or have lawns with clover, we do have a small lawn here, and there's a good clover mix in it. Pollinators love clover. Native plants, I really didn't get a chance to go into native plants. Often for flower gardens, a plant is developed, it's engineered for bloom, like double blossoms. And if you buy a plant that has double blossoms, it's not going to produce pollen and nectar because all of its energy's been engineered to go into its blooms. So when you pick your flower garden plants, as close to the original native plant as possible is the choice to make with pollinators in mind.
Wow.
Francie, by the way, amazing talk, but with the incentive of you can sell honey that I assume is part of people choosing to become a beekeeper and do it with honeybees, is there any easily identified payback to somehow encouraging these native bees, that is like the apple orchard? Can you make an economic argument to them that if they encourage, and how do you encourage these native bees? But is that just an awareness, and there could be incentives like selling honey to do what sounds like a better role of encouraging the more focused native bees?
I really don't like the question part because I always think of the perfect answer the next morning when I'm, it's a complicated question, a complicated answer. I don't want to do away with honeybees at all. That's not what I'm saying. I think we just need to focus more on native plants. There's enough guilt going on in terms of our impact on the natural world. And I'd rather focus on the positive, not mowing down the goldenrod, but seeing goldenrod as a plus. I'm involved in the community garden out across from the recycling center. And it's just a huge milkweed bonanza and goldenrod. And we manage that 6 acres pretty much for milkweed and goldenrod, as well as the community garden plots. And so I'd rather be positive in terms of what our impacts can be in our backyards. Parks, Rotary parks, town parks. There's also a whole nother talk on invasive plants. There are some invasive plants that are on the New Hampshire's list of invasive upland plants, and they're to be greatly discouraged. And so if we're managing our backyards, it's great to be aware of invasive plants that are taking over the native plants and doing our best to control them. Honeysuckles. Oh, there's a long list. The Peterborough Conservation Commission has a great booklet on invasive plants. The top 10 most invasive plants in our region. It's great to be aware of them. And if we see them in our backyards or byways, to do our best to control them. The more native plants, the better.
Rick?
Is there any way to put your slide presentation on our website?
Yeah, so the recording will go up there. And then I will send Francie an email and see if I can get a copy of the slides, if that's okay. And we could post them with the article on the website. Yep.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Anybody online have any questions? Okay, all right, well, thank you. Oh, Harry?
I got just one. Will you come back and talk with us about your invasive plant studies?
Yes, I have a slideshow. I have a slideshow on that too. Thank you.
Great.
Good. All right, great, thank you.
Thank you.